Combat with the blade in video games is often when fighting is at its best. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanks, let's talk about the 20 best sword fighting games. Starting off with Onimusha. Now, back in 2019, we fortunately got a nice remaster that looks nice, crisp, it's enjoyable to play, of what is really a classic game at this point. Originally for the PS2, this was a kind of hack and slash. It was a little slower in pace, and there was some strategy. In a lot of ways, that actually bore a little bit of similarity to Dark Souls, albeit looking so much like a Resident Evil game, despite the fact that it really didn't have a lot of survival horror going on. This was a game that involved a lot of sidestepping, particularly in the combat, but it was also punchy in a way that felt very satisfying, and the sound, at least for the time, was phenomenal. At number 19 is Ninja Gaiden, and we're talking the reboots on the Xbox, which are very much high speed, not far from Platinum Games style games. I mean, there's some key differences, but I don't know that we would talk about the original Ninja Gaiden games, which are just straight beat 'em ups, in terms of a sword fighting game. However, the Ninja Gaiden remakes have this certain rhythm to them where they keep everything very cinematic. Everything feels very big, intense. I mean, maybe with the exclusion of Ninja Gaiden Z, which is kind of a low-effort zombie game in the franchise, if I'm completely honest. What I personally like about the combat in Ninja Gaiden is it's kind of like God of War, except you can't switch attacks halfway through. You're kind of committed. You're forced to be more deliberate and strategic, despite the fact it's still this high-octane action game. At number 18 is Chivalry Medieval Warfare, which is just, if we didn't talk about this, it'd be nuts. This is a game from a good 6-7 years ago, and it really just shines in its combat. Like, it obviously is showing its age, graphically speaking, a bit, but this is first-person melee combat that is just a joy to participate in. From blocks, to jabs, to dodges, everything pretty much works exactly how you would think it would work from watching footage of this game, which is really nice to have it that intuitive. But it's not just that, it's how dense the action feels during the intensity of a match. This is a game that just doesn't seem to let up. The control scheme is really tactical, and yet you have to be doing things constantly and quickly because these matches are frenetic. Chivalry Medieval Warfare is just like one of the best examples of sword combat, period. At number 17 is Assassin's Creed Unity. Now, this was a game that had its downsides, I'm not gonna lie. But in terms of sword combat, I really enjoyed that it was able to take some influence from the Arkham games in terms of combat, but including the kind of blocking and parrying and dodging that is only possible with sword fighting. This was an area of the game that had a little bit of depth, while some areas were a little buggy, and there were some problems that, I mean, people still complain about to this day, but it's really hard for me to not look back at the sword fighting in that game really fondly. It was just a really good balance of kind of a beat-em-up feel with a slightly more robust moveset. Number 16 is Tenchu Stealth Assassins, which, let's just go ahead and say this is kind of a classic. It is not the most overtly complex combat system you are ever going to see or anything. It's fairly simple. There's blocking, attacking, and you're moving around to try to stop the other person from hitting you. It's my opinion that this deserves a spot on this list because it's a very early 3D sword fighting game that honestly holds up pretty well. It's kind of simple, but it is a rock solid game that I am happy to play to this day. At number 15 is Legend of Zelda. Now, this is a series that has been through many different eras, so I want to talk about the basics that have persisted throughout the entire series. Now, in the beginning, it was very simple combat. You could move in any direction. You could slash your sword. Basically, if there was an enemy on the tile above you or below you or to your side, you could hit them. You had a shield you could use to block. It got a little more advanced on the Super Nintendo, just in terms of becoming more fluid and introducing a lot more types of weapons, the charge move, and then it moved into 3D, and we've pretty much had a version of the same 3D combat, although it's developed to such a refined point. Truthfully, swordplay in Legend of Zelda has always been a joy, and although the weapons just sort of outright break in Breath of the Wild, it's probably the best iteration of the combat thus far. And number 14 is Ghost Runner, which is just this phenomenal Mirror's Edge descendant with sword combat. Basically, you're in a cyberpunk city and you're dealing with a bunch of enemies at pretty much any given time. You can slow down time, you can slash to the side, and you end up doing these really cool amounts of damage. You slice off limbs, heads, etc. It really does play like what if Mirror's Edge was a ninja combat game, and truthfully, it's probably one of the most fun sword-based games I've played in quite a while. At number 13 is Witcher 3. Now, Witcher 3 is not a game that I would immediately classify as just a sword game. It's obviously open world, lots of story, lots of dialogue trees, etc. But once you get the hang of using spells with your swordplay, the combat actually can become quite intricate, and beating a lot of specific enemies, like these various wraiths you basically have to trap in one of your spells every time you want to even hit them, creates a really interesting dynamic that I really got frustrated with a lot of times, to be completely honest. However, as I realized how important the spells actually were to the swordplay, the game became just significantly more interesting. And obviously, without combat, Witcher 3 would be a pretty interesting game, so that's saying a lot. At number 12 is Way of the Samurai. Now, this was a very out there game for a lot of reasons. This is super weird. It is set in 19th century Japan, and yet there are people who look like they belong in the disco era. I'm not going to address any of that. This game had a pretty good moveset regarding swordplay. You had a weak and a strong attack. You could also kick, which some of these games allowed you to do and some didn't. This would allow you to use a kick to disrupt. Then you'd also be able to build up to special attacks or collect items. I think probably the best aspect of it, though, is that you had the choice of whether or not you would engage in combat. Combat would always quickly evolve from like a single person to like a bunch of people, but you always also had the choice to just say, no, I don't want to get into this conflict, which is great. Way of the Samurai actually did a lot of stuff really well, despite it being kind of weird at times. At number 11 is For Honor, a single player, but let's just go ahead and say, like, for all intents and purposes, the real reason to play this was multiplayer, in my opinion at least. Melee-oriented, class-oriented battler. Now, the reason I thought that the multiplayer was so good is because it took the class stuff and gave you a little bit more customization options. The developers referred to this game as a shooter with swords, and I think that's a really appropriate way of putting it. But you'd get any variety of all these really interesting modes, from duels to brawling to 4 versus 4 team play. In terms of sword fighting, this is a really good place to at least start if you're looking for something multiplayer. At number 10 is Blade Symphony, a game that was made basically to fill the hole left by Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast. As that community sort of winded down, the developers needed something to fill the void. Now, being it's supposed to be like lightsaber combat, it's very flashy and fantastical and doesn't really go for any kind of realism. It is, however, like this incredibly fun acrobatic team-based fighting, or there's also death matches as well. Blade Symphony was a really interesting game and probably could have been a lot bigger. At number 9 is Kingdom Come Deliverance. If you can imagine basically a first-person Witcher without the mystical elements and some very detailed, physics-oriented swordplay, Kingdom Come Deliverance delivers. This was one of those games that really took itself very seriously and turned out good for it. This was a game where they hired a historian to ensure it was as accurate as possible, but I think what's most important about it is just how detailed the combat is. You do have a large amount at play at any given time, but angle of attack is so incredibly important in this game. And, you know, outside of the combat even, it's just a really interesting, like, really deep in history-oriented game. At number 8 is Mordhau, which is kind of like Kingdom Come Deliverance in a lot of ways, especially like combat. However, it is so much more oriented towards multiplayer combat. Basically, this was billed as a realistic medieval combat game, and it was. It was very speedy. I'll say it's not particularly realistic in movement, but in swordplay it is. I think there's some elements of the movement that feel a little bit video gamey in retrospect, but the way that swordplay works in it is very momentum-oriented and direction-oriented. It's a very novel control scheme, and I think that contributes to just how good the game itself is, and it gets some pretty great, intense multiplayer stuff going on. I'm probably going to go back to it just from mentioning it here. I played a lot of Mordhau when it came out. At number 7 is Soul Calibur, which is really different than most of the games that we've covered so far. It's a fighting game, and it plays like a fighting game. However, there is a ton of blade-oriented stuff in it. For one, you can overpower certain attacks with swords. Swords figure heavily into a lot of special attacks, etc., etc. It's also a series that's really kind of been on the cutting edge of graphics for the most part for a long time. More recently, it's kind of hard to say that on account pretty much everything is really incredible looking nowadays. But I've always really enjoyed Soul Calibur. The first time I played it was back on Dreamcast, and I still give the new ones a whirl when they come out. At number 6 is Bushido Blade. This was a 3D fighting game based entirely around swords as well. However, it was quite a bit earlier than Soul Calibur. It was also a fighting game actually developed by Square and published by Square as well. Bushido Blade was interesting in that you could change your stance. You were either holding the sword forward, upward, you could run, and it was really actually incredibly flexible regarding how you were attacking and also how you were defending. In truth, if there was a game that I would really like Square to revisit, it is Bushido Blade, which, yes, it is another fighting game, but it's not the same as Soul Calibur. It is very much less a traditional fighting game. It has a great story mode as well. At number 5 is Nidhogg, this really, really good 2D sort of action-adventure game that I think because of its weirdness is kind of ignored. It has this combat that is very frenetic. You could do everything from straight attacks to blocking to throwing swords to throwing yourself. I mean, there is a lot you can do in this game, and it's also just such a unique looking game. It reminds me of something like Toe Jam and Earlish, except obviously it's a vastly different game from that. At number 4 is Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, which was just a really interesting title, especially given the types of combat that was in it. Now, many people have made this observation, is that Sekiro is kind of a rhythm-based combat game without music that is dictating the rhythm. You kind of just have to detect it out of your enemies. And I think just that insight sets Sekiro pretty much apart from almost any other game on here. But it's also a fantastic Dark Souls type game with a lot of different mechanics like the grappling hook. Just like with Bloodborne, it's different enough from Dark Souls that it justifies being a separate thing. And honestly, I hope we see sequels to both, but Sekiro 2 would be just fantastic. At number 3 is Mount and Blade 2 Bannerlord, a sequel to the medieval combat of the original, obviously. A lot of time passed between these games. You're not just doing sword combat, you're also really gathering, commanding lots of different soldiers. Your swinging is directional, blocking is very context-oriented. It's really interesting to sort of set up the command with a bunch of different soldiers and then participate in the battle. I mean, this is really a battle simulator. You can storm the castle, literally. And number 2 is the Dark Souls trilogy, which, let's just go ahead and say it. If we're going to talk about sword combat in games, this is one that we have to. Zelda is one that we have to. This is one that we have to. Dark Souls is an incredibly skill-based game that throws so many curveballs at you that you're just constantly learning what this game wants from you. Where Sekiro is kind of a rhythm-based version of this combat, what you're doing here is really caring about dodging and blocking. Without a good strategy with those, you're not getting anywhere fast in Dark Souls. I mean, you could get somewhere, but again, not fast in Dark Souls. It is a patience-oriented game, and it is a world that is rich in lore that the further you get into, the more you feel like a part of everything. And at number 1 is Ghost of Tsushima, which, aside from just being like an amazing open world game with one of the prettiest visual styles I think I've seen in a game, it manages to combine a few different styles of swordplay, particularly directional swordplay, but kind of more open worldy type swordplay, if that makes sense. Like, there's no lock-on, so it's not especially like Zelda, but at times I feel like I'm playing Zelda still. However, the key is always breaking the enemy's defenses and then hitting when the timing is right. It's really just a couple of different things in one that just feels natural. And that's, for lack of a better term, natural really is, I think, what we all want a game to feel like. We don't want it to have to be explained. And Ghost of Tsushima is probably the game, in my opinion, that has probably best done it, in truth. It is an amazing game, and I cannot wait for more in the series. Couple of bonuses for you. Dishonored, which is obviously not specifically a sword combat game. However, when you are locked in sword combat with an enemy, it's amazing. Obviously, the point of the game is to avoid combat. That's how you get the good ending. However, sometimes it's really just hard to resist, stealthing in and causing some trouble. Next on bonus is Hellspit Arena, a virtual reality horror slasher in which you're basically cutting down various dark fantasy bad guys with a VR sword. And yes, it's so satisfying. It is just amazing. It works exactly like how it looks like it works. You swing a sword around and be awesome. That's the game. Finally is Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, a game in which the sword is used in such a novel way. You could chop various things up. You could use it for enemies, and it would really be lethal as hell and kind of look like anime when they chop somebody and then they come apart. I mean, how could we not mention that? But what's your favorite blade slinging games? Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. So click subscribe. Do not forget to enable all notifications. And as always, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter, Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on GameRanks.